Greetings. This lecture is Working with Organized Labor, so you'll understand what it means to be working in a union and specifically how to do collective bargaining, or at least at the most basic level, so you understand it as you get into different kinds of organizations. Not every company is managed well by employers and managers. A lot of times they will do everything they can to short-circuit their employees. They don't invest in them, and they treat them with largely with indifference. And so unions came about to equalize the playing field, if you will, between managers and employees, because one employee by themselves doesn't have a lot of power to fight against management, but a large number of employees who can band together with one voice to argue for what they want can do really well. And then when you have a legal entity like a union, you have much more power over that. The beautiful thing about the union is because they have a lot of laws that support them, they can go head-to-head with management who may be doing bad things to the organization. That's not to say that the union is above reproach and that they don't do anything wrong, because many times unions get so stuck in a rut that they have only one idea about how to manage things that they sort of forget that there are other ways of working, and that they could actually be more cooperative, and that they don't face the relationship with their management team as is always so negative. And so that becomes a big challenge, is when are unions useful and when have they outlived their usefulness and are actually almost as abusive as sometimes bad managers can be. And so our goal, is at this point is not to make that judgment. Mostly our goal is to understand why unions have an important role in many organizations in which they exist, and that unionization can be a real threat to organizations who are not doing well by their employees, by not paying them well or having horrible working conditions, things like that. So we'll proceed from here. U.S. labor unions existed for a long period of time. They've existed in the 1800s, but of course they had no force of law behind them because they were not considered a legal entity until 1935. For the most part, as you know, our employment relationship in the workplace is typically one of being at will, except if you have a specific contract. And unionization is one of those examples of a contract that manages how people should be paid, what their working conditions will look like, what kind of benefits they have. Of course, no one wants to work in a situation where a union is constraining you from doing the kinds of things that you want to do within the boundaries of the law and in fairness. But if you have the tendency to pay people less or try to find ways to skirt your responsibilities to your employees, then a unionized environment is going to come in and create those boundary conditions for you, so that you learn, these behaviors are acceptable as an employer and these are not acceptable as an employer. But if you're doing a good job with your people, no one really wants to unionize, and certainly no one wants to have a third party interfere, with their management decisions. And so it always is a better bet for employers to think about what can I do to help my employees to perform the best that they can be, and what can I do to make sure that I can trust my employees, that they can do a good job. I'm going to pay them a fair wage for a fair day's work, and things of that nature. Most employers obviously prefer that non-unionized environment, understandable, but the bottom line is, unions have to do their job and do their part in order to be well integrated into the organization, and if they don't, they are just as bad as any other employer out there. In the 30s, when unionization first came into being, it was widely supported. Everybody who worked in industry would definitely work to get get themselves unionized so they could get the protections under the law. But what we noticed is over time, unionization has gone down, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One major reason is that we are not the same manufacturing environment these days. Another issue is many industries, as they've grown up, have learned lessons from the unionization process, and so they actually accept unions, or they welcome them in so that it's not a problem, but mostly that they accept the practices that unions fight for. So unions have fought hard for good benefits and good working conditions and good safety, and lo and behold, employers recognize that this can be a good thing and a good investment in their employees. It actually benefits them, so what they will do is make sure that the organization actually has all the right benefits and working conditions and approaches to managing people, so that it makes the possibility of a union seem unreasonable. If you're doing all the right things, there is no reason for a union. The union is there to equalize power, but if you are already recognizing the power of your employees and you're providing for them, then there's really no need to add a union to that process. So that's another issue. And then lastly, the unions have done a really good job in that they've really fought hard for benefits and working conditions and making sure that there's no child labor and that we have a 5-day work week and those sorts of things. I mean, weekends free we take for granted, but in the early 1900s that didn't exist. People worked 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. Children had to work, and so the unions fought really hard for these types of legal constraints to impose on organizations so that they couldn't do those sorts of behaviors anymore. So they've almost sort of made themselves, they've marginalized themselves because they've actually done a really good job of fixing the problems that existed in the workplace. All right, moving on to the next slide. What is the overview, the basic overview of what is a union? A union specifically is, as it says there, an independent organization that represents the employee's interests and deals with things like wages and working conditions and hours. And that's really the boundaries of what they work on. It's like, what are the hours that I'm going to work? What kind of working conditions will I work within? And then what kind of wages / benefits, the total compensation stuff. What kind of wages and benefits will be addressed in that. And so once we figure that out, that is a really great thing. And those are the boundary conditions in which unions organize. Those are the mandatory items. They can negotiate other items, but that's only if the management team agrees to them. So if you have a good relationship with the organization, then there's a lot of things that can be negotiable if management says it's okay to do that. But at the bare minimum, they have to be able to negotiate their wages, their hours, and their working conditions. Why do people join unions? Well, as I've said, they don't like their job. They don't feel like they're getting proper pay or benefits or working conditions. They don't like the way they're being treated by their management team. And in those situations, if they feel like they have no power and that they can't influence the process, they will turn around and seek a union. And the belief is that the union has to, whatever the cost is to have the union, that it is worth the cost to have them involved in the process, because without them, they will lose, from not having a union there. So the instrumentality of that union has to be pretty high. They really have to believe that the union can do way more for them than they can do for themselves, and that the organization won't listen to them without the union being there. So union has to be looked at as the only solution, or the solution of last resort, if you will, without having to necessarily, sue for damages and things like that. In terms of the legal environment, there's 3 basic laws that you have to be aware of. The Wagner Act from 35, TaftHartley in 47, and then Landrum-Griffin in 59. In our next slide talks about the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act basically legalized the existence of unions, and it established an organization called the National Labor Relations Board, which is a federal agency, and its primary responsibility is to certify unions, so that when there's a union election in an organization, it will be able to certify that it was a legal election, and therefore the election it stands, and the union exists or doesn't exist, depending on what the outcome of the vote is. They also investigate any kind of unfair labor practices, very similar to like the EEOC, how they might review anybody who violates employment law, and discriminates illegally. The NLRB has a little bit more power than the EEOC, because they can actually have a finding and penalize people because of those findings. But they do some similar work to what the EEOC does, in that the EEOC investigates things and they certify whether or not there's actually illegal discrimination going on. And that's what the NLRB does. They'll investigate and determine whether or not there's an unfair labor practice. And then if they do, then that is a binding finding, and then that has to be remedied in the courts and with penalties or changes in the way the collective bargaining or union management relationship is growing. The NLRB can issue a cease and desist order if management interferes with union formation, if it discriminates against union members, and if it refuses to bargain with the union. And so it has this power to tell the management team that you can't do that, and you're not allowed to do that, and it's against the law to do that. So they do have an enormous amount of power and influence in that process, and so they can basically tell them what they can or can't do. The TaftHartley and Landrum-Griffin sort of took what the Wagner Act did, and it put some boundary conditions around it. First of all, with Taft-Hartley, it protects management and workers from union coercion, basically where a union comes in and tries to coerce people to join. So it becomes this strong-arming tactics that a union will come in and push people around and try to make sure that everybody joins, and then they mislead people and they do all sorts of things. So what this did was it said, unions are legitimate, but only to a certain extent. They can't misbehave and try to abuse people to get them to join the union. They can't mislead people to get them to join the union. And so what Taft-Hartley and Landrum-Griffin did is it started to limit some of the powers of unions and fine-tune what they can and can't do. Again, when we talk about the employment laws, right? They start really broad, and then we use case law to narrow them. And it was the same thing. We have case law, and then we had additional acts and laws that had to pass to say, well, the Wagner Act says these things, but let's limit and have you understand some of the boundaries around, what you can and can't do when it comes to those kind of laws. Another thing that Taft-Hartley did is it prohibited discrimination against non-unionized organizations and individuals. And so if you don't belong to a union, it doesn't mean that you would not be eligible to work for a company that is unionized. Just because I've never worked for a union before doesn't mean I wouldn't work there now. And it also makes sure that we don't treat organizations that aren't unionized differently and penalize them because they've chosen not to unionize. So we have to be really, sort of careful about those things. It made it illegal to refuse to bargain in good faith. And a good faith basically means I come to the table with the understanding that I'm going to have to come to an agreement, and I'm going to do everything I can to try to meet that agreement. If you walk into a negotiation and you basically say, I don't care what you say, I don't want to ever come to any kind of agreement, I hate this thing, I only want things my way, I don't care what they want, and so I'm never going to negotiate, I'm never going to give in on any points, it's always going to be what I want and nothing else. That's not bargaining in good faith. Bargaining in good faith is recognizing that you're going to have to give up some things to get some things. So you have to set your priorities, you have to decide what issues that are going to be negotiated are high priorities for you, and which are things that are throwaways that are not as important and you can let go as a trade item to make your negotiation go well. There are a number of other unethical practices out there, but we'll get into those as we move along. Landrum Griffin was about making sure that unions didn't abuse their membership. For example, making sure that the leaders were really good about managing financials, that a union couldn't take somebody's money and then not have it available for them, when needed. So unions collect dues for a reason. It supports the salaries of the union workers, but what it also does is it ensures that there's a strike fund that it's available if people are on strike, so that people can pull money as they need to pay for bills and things like that. So a lot of times what was happening is unions were taking the money and then they were going on trips someplace, and then they didn't have the money available for their members when they needed it. So Landrum Griffin said, well, obviously, we need to have better fiscal responsibility in terms of the way that we manage things, and we need to make sure that our union members are protected from corrupt union leaders. Because the bottom line is union leaders are leaders, and they are just as much open to corruption as any organizational leader would be. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as the saying goes. So, as people get into positions of power, they are more likely to find shortcuts and do things that benefit them and not the people they're representing. It also made sure that unions had a Bill of Rights, what they could expect from their union members. They had an agreement with the union, which is upheld in their Constitution and their Bill of Rights, just as we would have in our own government. If these people are representing me and I vote them in to represent me, I need to know what my rights are. I need to know what the boundary conditions are of our relationship, what they can and can't do for me. And so every union has their own constitution and an own agreement with their employer, with their employees and members about what they will or won't do for them. And the last thing is it basically said that the union elections need to be regulated by the government, which is basically they need to be regulated by the National Labor Relations Board in a way that was much more intense than they had in the past. All right, moving on. Next slide talks about labor relations in the United States and what we can expect. The labor relations in the U.S. is sort of different than Europe, and we won't get into the nuances of what Europe is, but the bottom line is what you should know, that our unions expect and understand that we're in a capitalist system. In Europe, they don't. They want things to be much more socialistic or communistic, in that there's sort of this sharing of all the wealth among everybody, and that's not how labor unions work here in the United States. Our labor unions absolutely accept that this is a capitalist structure, that it's not going to be socialist or communist, but it also wants to make sure that that things are done fairly. And that the manager doesn't have to, hoard all the money and then keep their people, in poverty in order to make the business work. So there's 6 basic characteristics of unions in the U.S. That there's business unionism. Basically, they focus on worker well-being, and really they don't really want to run the business. They want their voice in helping the workers have a better life working for the company, but they don't want to share in running the company. They don't want board positions. They don't want managerial positions. They just want to make sure that the employees, who are completely happy being employees, and they are actually being treated in the right way. The second characteristic is that unions are structured based on the kind of work people are doing. And so we know we have electrical workers unions, and we have carpenters unions and plumbers unions. A lot of the crafts are under AFL-CIO. AFL-CIO these days tends to be much more politically active than they are necessarily active in terms of recruiting people and membership. Change to Win, as the sort of overarching sort of union body, is much more focused on increasing union membership. So AFL-CIO, while many unions are members of the AFL-CIO, AFL-CIO's major purpose is not increasing enrollment, but in influencing the political process. Change to Win, their primary unions that are a big part of that, are primarily focused on growing their numbers. Third category is characteristic is that there's a focus on collective bargaining. Our goal is we want to negotiate better wages, hours and working conditions, period. And that's what they hope to accomplish there. In terms of item number 4, that it's the labor contract that creates the working relationship. It's no longer at will. Now we have an agreement on what the hours, what the wages, and what the working conditions will be like. So if I'm doing HR in that kind of environment, then I have to refer to my employment contract, with the union to know how I can manage these people to be able to do their job. Unions, last item is that unions are, item number 5, unions are growing in the public sector. We find that there are more people joining unions, for example, if they're working for state or municipal or federal government. So union growth is happening in the public sector, working for the government, but they don't have as much power because they lose a lot of rights. For example, government employees are not allowed to strike. And because they're not allowed to strike, because governments have to keep moving and keep running, they lose a lot of their bargaining power, because the power to walk off the job is pretty powerful. And it's pretty influential. So if I then decide that I'm not going to strike, that gives, if I cannot strike, that gives the employer a lot more power than they would in any other condition. So, being able to vote, though, changes who's in power in the government, and, then that's the way that public employees get their power. They can just vote somebody out of office if they really don't like them and put influence on political appointees to appoint the government agencies to appoint people who will be more sympathetic to their issues. So, other things about labor relations in the workplace is that there's a lot of adversarial issues going on. It tends to be us versus them when we think about those relationships. The us is, we're good because we're the union, and everybody else is against us. We're bad, or vice versa. Us is the organization, and we're powerful, and everybody else who's not part of that part of the organization management is not good. So it sort of sets people up in an us versus them situation where I'm right and you're wrong, and that creates a lot of tension between all the parties. One of the last issues, too, is that union membership is declining, as we've talked about. It's down quite a bit. I think probably around 10 or 15 12%, 10 to 15%, somewhere in there, and it's coming down, and as I said, for many reasons. The non-unionized sector is growing. Manufacturing is a smaller part of our whole economic base. So there's much more service industry out there, and service industry is much less likely to be unionized. So these are, part of those issues. Other types of labor relations strategies, things that we can expect, particularly because it's adversarial, we can find that there may be open conflict on the one extreme between labor and management, where they do nothing but fight each other, and we see strikes pretty regularly. Then there's an armed truce where we can try to work through things, and we might not like each other, but at least we make an attempt. To get things done. Working harmony is a better situation where we recognize that we've got to work together and that we are much more likely to cooperate. But labor management cooperation is that ideal situation where we are partners with the union as opposed to adversaries with the union. And as the management team, we do everything we can to work with the union to make things work well. And so if we're in a situation where we respect the union and its role, and we respect our employees, and we're doing the right thing, that creates a good situation for everybody all around. So because it's adversarial in nature, we sort of, it's always an us versus them, we have this whole range of ways that we can build relationships, with the management team and with the union, between the union and management team, so that we can hopefully get to a place where we approach labor management cooperation. In those companies where we see labor management cooperation, there it's a much more successful and harmonious relationship. and employees are treated much better in those kind of conditions. So something to think about. In terms of other parts of strategies, you can either accept the union as it comes in, or you could try to avoid the union. So if you're in a situation where your employees want to organize, you can give it up and just accept it and recognize that you need to make some changes, or you can and just bring them in, or you can try to do what we call union avoidance. One form of union avoidance is appropriate and legal, and that's called union substitution. Another form is not so legal. It's called union suppression. And union substitution is focused on how we can do all the right things to make the instrumentality of the union irrelevant. Meaning, we can make the need for a union to be minimized so that we start as an employer paying people better and doing the right thing and arguing that you're right, we made a mistake, so we will do the right thing now, and we don't need to have a union for us to step up to the plate and do the right thing. Union suppression is where the management team actively interferes with and tries to remove the union from the process, and they try to fight the union organization as best as they can. The goal is we can accept the union as is, or we can do the right thing and succumb to the pressure to do the right thing by removing the need for a union, or we can fight the union tooth and nail, which is not what we want. And there are many union suppressing tactics that are illegal and inappropriate. So the labor relations process is three basic steps. We organize the union, which means that either an employee approaches a union or a union might approach an employee about the possibility of organizing. So they are solicited one way or the other. Then people have to spread the word about the union and what its benefits are. So we start getting the word out, and we have to make sure, obviously, that we're not interfering with people's ability to do their job. We want them to make sure that the employees can still do their job, but that we are talking to them during their lunch hours, or we're talking to them after hours, and we're letting them know what we can do for them as a union. And so there's laws and policies around what you can and can't do, in those early days before the union organizes, and there's certain things that managers can or can't do in those early days of organizing. Once the employees decide to unionize, a certification election occurs, and the union is then either voted in or it's not, and then the NLRB will certify that, and then ultimately we begin the next step in the process, which is the collective bargaining and contract administration. The Employee Free Choice Act is getting at the idea is that if it passes, it allows workers to form unions without a secret ballot election. It also allows union organizers to form a union simply by having a majority of employees sign an authorization card. So a certain percentage of employees, if you have I think it's 75% or more who say they want the union, we don't need to go through an election. It automatically gets certified. So we don't have to go through an election process. If you have less than that, but still the majority, you can still certify that an election has to take place. But once you hit a certain critical mass of people who have signed it, if they have agreed to it, then the choice is theirs to unionize. So in the next step of the process after the organization part is the collective bargaining, and that's where we negotiate all of the boundary and all the elements in the contract, the wages, the working conditions, and the hours. Everybody has to bargain in good faith, meaning you come to the table with the understanding that you will come to a negotiated agreement, which means you're going to win some, you're going to lose some, and that each party has to develop what their wants and needs are and come to the table to have that discussion. Obviously, bargaining power differs based on how powerful that union is or how powerful management is. If you have the power to strike, you have an enormous amount of power in your hands. If you don't have that power to strike, then the management team has more power. Some unions are more powerful than others, and so this sort of varies. And as people have power, that really influences the whole bargaining process. In terms of bargaining types, we can have a distributive agreement, which is I win, you lose. We assume that there's only one piece of pie, and I'm either going to win it or I'm going to not win it. That we believe that the resources and the boundary conditions of our agreement are sort of a zero sum. I either win or I lose. An integrative agreement says, no, we can actually have win-win agreements where I can get everything I need and you can get everything you need, and neither party feels like they're losing tremendously. I mean, we can find win-win agreements. It's not always, I win, you lose, and that's part of doing, prisoner's dilemma games, right? It's all sort of zero sum. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't have to work that way. But if you go in with that attitude, that's what you're going to end up. Then you're going to end up feeling like you are on the losing end of the deal, or you feel like you're not being represented appropriately. Good guidelines for integrative bargaining is obviously you want to understand the other person's needs and objectives, but that person has to be very transparent about what their needs and objectives are. So both parties have to be truthful about what they need, what they want, and what they're trying to accomplish. And if they're not honest about that, that's where the us versus them starts to come into play. We end up in a more distributive environment where I'm going to win and you're going to lose, and I'm going to take whatever I can as quickly as I can. Integrative bargaining requires a free flow of information. We want to see commonalities among employees, and so our goal is if we can get people to find out what they have in common as opposed to what they have different, that makes it a lot easier, and hence the next comment about minimizing differences. We want to make sure that the solutions are addressing everybody's needs, that it's not a solution that only meets my needs but not yours. We want to try to find a solution that enables you to get what you want and me to get what I need at the same time. And we have to be really flexible with others. In our MBA curriculum, we have a course in negotiation where we talk about how do we get people to understand someone else's point of view and then move them towards coming to more integrative agreements. Bargaining topics. What kind of things can we bargain? Well, we have the mandatory items, which are wages and hours and working conditions. Then we have things that are called permissive, which are things that both parties have to agree to negotiate. And basically, management has a prerogative to say that they will or won't negotiate certain items because they retain a lot of power. But things like, if somebody wants to serve on the board in a non-elective position, or if they want to negotiate retirement benefits or things of that nature, or maybe some extra perks that might be available to folks. So those are sorts of things. What is illegal, of course, is things like feather bedding and other discriminatory practices, and the whole point of those is to create more conflict, right? Feather bedding is where we hire people, we end up hiring people who are union members who we know are trying to get us organized, and we add more union members who are agitators to be pro-union, and so that's kind of inappropriate because all we're doing is just creating more of a problem, or we try to anyway. We're just trying to we're trying to push people to do something that they don't want to do, and we're doing it in a way we're sort of forcing their hand or politicizing the process in such a way that it becomes just untenable for us to be able to negotiate in good faith. We can't illegally argue discriminatory practices and say, well, all right, well, we'll only hire women, or we'll only hire men, or we'll only hire a certain religion or something like that. You can't bargain that. It's illegal to do that. You can't bargain things that are going to cause conflict or are illegal. That's just not possible. So you're violating public policy by negotiating items that are considered illegal no matter what. So, union contracts will supersede, employment at will conditions, but union contracts cannot negotiate things that are illegal or against public policy. Impasses in bargaining are things like when we are really not getting anywhere, and you are holding firm on what you want, and I'm holding firm on what I want, and we can't seem to find common ground. Then we have things called economic strikes or wildcat strikes or lockouts. An economic strike is basically where the union certifies that if this doesn't happen, employees are going to strike, which means they walk out on the job. Those are planned and they're organized and they're considered legal under the law. A wildcat strike is a strike where the union members walk out without the permission of the union itself. So they might decide today, you know what, I don't like the way you treated my friend, we're all leaving today. None of us are coming into work. Things like the blue flu, where people get really sick, they say they're sick, and they don't show up to work. That's a sort of an informal way of wildcat striking, where it's just people just don't show up at all to work, and they just, without necessarily calling a formal strike. A lockout, on the other hand, is where the manager and the management team says, well, we're not going to let the unions come to work. And this is what happened with the NHL a number of years ago. The team owners locked out all of the team players who were unionized and basically said, we're not going to let you play. And many of those teams, of course, were hurting for money, but at the same time, it didn't cost them anything to run other than their administrative costs to actually manage, the stadiums that they were playing in and things like that, or the infrastructure of the organization. So they didn't have to pay salaries. They said, look, I don't like your agreement, and you're not playing fair. And if you're not going to play fair, we're going to just lock you out and not let you play at all. And so that's another way that we can get through these impasses in bargaining is by, putting on some pressure through strikes or lockouts, one side or the other. It's both basically two sides of the same thing. I walk away from the table if I'm not happy. A mediator helps us to come to an agreement, and so you can bring in a mediator. If the two parties can't come to an agreement, obviously what you'd like to do is to try to use the mediator before you get to these strikes and the lockouts, but if the mediator fails, then clearly the strikes are the alternatives that you have available to you. But what we want is to make sure that a mediator can help find the common grounds that maybe both parties can't see for whatever reason, and if the mediator can help people see the common ground, that enables them to move forward and do their job. In terms of contract administration, we have grievance procedures. If something is going wrong and then people aren't following the rules, we have to apply a grievance. And the grievances can either be based on how we interpret the contract and the agreement, or if there's a discipline process that's needed because someone is clearly misbehaving in the boundaries of the law and the boundaries of the contract. And so we can have a grievance to make sure that someone is following the policies of the contract one way or the other. So our grievance procedure is how we settle disputes between labor and management. A steward is the person who is the union representative that helps to advocate for the employee in the workplace. And this person has, a full-time job as an employee of the company, but they also have this extra responsibility of stewarding or managing, that labor management relationship. There's sort of the go-between between labor and management to help things move forward. Arbitration is what happens if we cannot come to an agreement, and ultimately we go to what is supposed to be an impartial third party, and that impartial third party will say, you can, yes or no, this is what happens. I agree with you, but I don't agree with you, or this is what my ruling is. It's sort of like a judge ruling, but it's less expensive and less extensive process of resolving a workplace dispute than going to court. So it's sort of it's a substitute for going to court. Manager's role in labor relations, obviously, we can have, as an HR role, we can become a labor management specialist or a labor relations specialist, and there are programs all over the country. University of Illinois is one, for example. University of Minnesota is another. Rutgers University is another, where people can negotiate and learn how to negotiate contracts as an HR professional. You are the one responsible for overseeing the grievances and administrating the contract, basically. Management's role in all of this as the labor relations specialist is under the HR department, and the manager's job is to make sure that the work environment is open and honest, and that they really work hard to resolve agreements, that they understand the basics of the employment law and what the collective bargaining contract is so that people can do their job, and they may have to serve on occasion on grievance committees to make things work. What's the impact of unions on human resource management? Unions limit a lot of the flexibility of things that can be done in HR. And managers are looking for efficiency a lot of times, and unions are not necessarily focused on that. Unions are more focused on fairness, even if it's a little bit more of a burden to the organization. Whereas managers are looking much more for efficiency in the way things get done. So we want to, we're looking for the least amount of cost to get things done, and that's not always what management wants. When there's a union, obviously they are forced to do what the workers want as opposed to what the managers want, and that's really the big difference there. All the things that we do in HR, the staffing, development, compensation, relations, all those sorts of things, it differs in a unionized environment. When it comes to staffing, all of our recruiting and selection is done within a seniority system, the bona fide seniority system, as we've talked about a number of times. And in those bona fide seniority systems, the person with the highest rank gets the opportunity for the jobs, and they ultimately are the ones that get the jobs. So assuming that they meet the minimum requirements. In terms of employee development, we are less likely to see an enormous amount of development, but our goal in there is that we can use the performance appraisals to help them to develop better, but a lot of times, but it doesn't affect their pay, because their pay is all related to what the collective bargaining agreement is, right? But the development, we use our performance appraisals to help with development and helping them to become better workers and figuring out where their skill gaps are so they can improve. Compensation, obviously, is all based on what the collective bargaining agreement is. Unionized companies that are unionized tend to have higher wages across the board than companies that are non-unionized. So you will get even if you are a non-unionized member of an organization that has a union in it, you are more likely to see a salary bump because of that. There's what we call that a spillover effect. Also, you're more likely to see in a unionized environment a cost of living adjustment, which is basically where the company will look at the pay line and they'll decide to move the pay line up, to bump it up so that there's a higher level of pay available to people across the board. So everyone will get a 10% increase or a 5% increase depending on what the cost of living adjustment needs to be. The last thing that unions, what we'll see in terms of unions in HR is that there's greater employee relations in that there's a much more of a formalized communication network for people to have a voice, to be able to grieve when they need to have a grievance, and to advocate for themselves through the union process. And so employee relations are different in a unionized environment because you're now dealing with the union process and the union voice and how that union voice influences that process. And so performance appraisals, recruitment and selection, training, compensation, employee relations, all these things vary based on the union environment and the union contract. And then we have to follow those things when we are, working in an organization that has a unionized environment. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later.